Okay, we're going to continue the theme of talking about the Atlantic as a superhighway during the 18th century, or said differently, the 1700s. Triangular trade is part of the colonies as a result of the Navigation Acts, which we talked about in an earlier lecture, where we said that the English Parliament was trying to bring about some more economic order to the colonies. And the Navigation Acts bring together parts of the old world and the new world. Triangular trade is a phrase that's been used quite often to describe what's going around the different colonies and different parts of the world during the 1700s. Again, it's kind of that fictional ship that's going from one part of the world to another. That one that might start in Boston, for example, and bring fish and naval stores to different parts of the English world. You can see it playing out here in this slide. Back from England, that ship would then go and take manufactured products, for example, maybe to other parts of Europe, or in this case, we might send this ship in this fictional voyage to the coast of West Africa to bring slaves to different parts of the New World, maybe to Newport, Rhode Island, or to Charleston, South Carolina. More than likely, we know slaves would be going on ships with the Middle Passage to the West Indies. You might also, after selling slaves after the Middle Passage in the West Indies, you would maybe travel to parts of the other Caribbean islands and bring molasses on this ship back to New England or to other parts of the American colonies. That molasses would then be turned into rum. So again, this is maybe a triangle because it might go to 4 different parts of the globe isn't exactly accurate, but we're beginning to see an increased network of trade as the 1700s roll along. So that's something I wanted to stress today, and we'll go back to the notes and discuss some of the major industries in the American colonies. Agriculture is the major industry. The colonies just don't produce finished goods to the extent that the Europeans or the English do. 90% of people in the American colonies do small farming for their family. A little bit of it is for export, but the number of export crops is usually in the area of the big plantation crops grown in the South, mostly by servants and increasingly after 1700 slaves. So if we were to discuss the big 3 exports as far as the agricultural crops from the Americas, and by that I would include North America, which is part of the United States, and areas that are now the Caribbean or the British West Indies. Overwhelmingly, we may not be surprised to discover that sugar, which isn't grown on the mainland, it's not grown in places like Louisiana and Florida until really the late 1700s at the early 1800s for the most part. It's the most profitable crop is sugarcane and the European American colonies. It far exceeds any of the other 2 crops that we're going to talk about. Maybe a distant second, we would say rice. Rice grown in the Carolinas. They were eventually growing rice in areas of southeastern North Carolina, and as we are going to discover, it also proved to be very successful in the last British mainland colony, and that is Georgia. It also dictates, does rice, the makeup of the individuals and specifically the race of those who were there in the Low Country, overwhelmingly African and African American, to the tune of 80 to possibly 90% by the early 1700s in South Carolina, making South Carolina the only mainland colony with a black majority. So that's all about the production of rice. We also know that in Carolina and Georgia, they would supplement rice by growing indigo and some tobacco and later a little bit of cotton as well. If you were to move further north in the South, you would obviously stumble upon large plantations and farms that were growing wheat, and they were raising animals, growing corn. Some food crops were absolutely necessary for this part of the world, but overwhelmingly tobacco would be the major cash crop in Maryland and in Virginia. The middle colonies, if we're going from the south to the north, were home to the export of American grain. And by the middle colonies, we're talking about the old Dutch colony of New Netherland, now New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. They're kind of also nicknamed the breadbasket colonies, but the middle colonies are both ethnically diverse because we have many non-English people there. But places like New York, which had started out at first as an area that exported different beaver pelts and animal pelts as part of the fur trade, was now becoming very successful in shipping out upwards of 80,000 barrels a year of flour. And so that's why we get the reputation in those middle colonies. They have a longer growing season than New England. You're not seeing sprawling plantations that are worked by slaves, as in the American South, but certainly more successful areas of growing different crops than further north in New England. Then when we move to New England, fishing and whaling and small crops. Again, you don't hear mentions of plantations. There's no giant cash crops in the manner of indigo or rice or tobacco in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Shipbuilding, small crops, and shipbuilding, fishing, whaling. Again, that's all connected to, of course, the shipbuilding industry. And these are ships that are going out by the hundreds every year and combing the North Atlantic for cod, which they bring back to the shores. They would clean the fish, salt it to preserve it, and then send it back to different parts of the world, whether it be Europe or back to English and non-English or French or Dutch colonies in the West Indies to feed colonists, servants, and more slaves. So fish was a critical part, and you need ships to go out and fish in these waters. So the shipbuilding industry, the merchant marine, ships that are going around the world, American Yankee-built ships that are hauling British and European goods. It was called the carrying trade. And if we talked about that fictional voyage that we started with the PowerPoint slide that had the map with all the different things going around the world, American sugar in the form of molasses that would be going up from the British West Indies can go to Europe. It can go from areas of the West Indies to New England and turn molasses into rum. Rum would then go back to different parts of the world, whether it be Africa or to Europe. Once it got to Europe, it would pick up Spanish wine, oranges that would then go through London and then would be re-exported, because under the Navigation Acts, if you purchased English or European goods, they would have to stop at a European port first, specifically an English port, and then go back to the American colonies. Again, this was the goal. This was the vision when the colonies were created. They were going to supply the raw materials, and they in turn would purchase the manufactured goods, the finished items that made life more livable. And those items were made exclusively in Europe and in England, where there was a strong manufacturing base. There is not a strong manufacturing base in the colonies. Sometimes they made things like beaver hats. They did some of their own household spinning to take wool from different animals and to be able to manufacture it into, again, pretty rough cloth. They could do that to supplement what they were purchasing. Everyone wanted to be self-sufficient, but sometimes you had to buy things from overseas. England would later, in its history, under a new set of navigation acts, pass the Hat Act that literally told the colonists, hey, don't make hats because we want you to purchase hats from either Europe, then they would go through an English port and go back to the Americas, or through actually an English broker or someone who was running that kind of store, and you'd place an order for those things based on what you were exporting. So not a lot of manufacturing done in the colonies. You do see a prevalence of iron forges dotting the landscape of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Let me go and show you another map just to give you kind of a synopsis of what we're talking about with the manufacturing and what's coming out of the American colonies. So this time, like before, we'll start in the south, and you can see that in areas all the way along the Savannah River in what's now Georgia, up through Charleston, and even, as I mentioned before, areas of southeastern North Carolina, rice and indigo. Again, further north, when you get to the middle part of North Carolina, tobacco all the way up to modern day Maryland and even to Delaware, where the growing season could support that. But then you turn to the American North, and then cattle and grain of different kind. Again, barley, hops, any kind of wheat. Those would be rye. All would be grown along with raising different animals, and cattle exports would be critically important as well. You see in areas if you look at the map in Massachusetts, just south of Boston, those barrels are symbolizing rum distilleries. We also have mention of, as far as New England is concerned, the trees. That would be a very successful lumber and timber, where the English, before any colonies were started in the early 1600s, those who were traveling across the Atlantic on behalf of England knew that the forest would be a resource. And so forestry was a big deal. The naval stores, you can see that represented in eastern North Carolina, the naval store industry. Tar, pitch, turpentine, these are items that you need to waterproof British ships, whether they be cargo ships, which are built in the American colonies, or what they would often do in England is a representative of the king would go through the forest and find the best, hardiest trees and mark them. And if you were to be foolish enough to cut down any of these trees that were going to be set aside to build the masts of British ships, either made in the colonies or back in England, you would get yourself fined or worse, thrown in jail. So moving south, you can see the importance of shipbuilding. It goes all the way into southern New England in places like Connecticut and Rhode Island, New York and New Jersey. You can see the iron forges represented by the bars that are there. And of course, in places in the American South, we see cattle and grain important in the interior. Again, that tells us a couple of things. First of all, the climate doesn't always support the plantation crops such as rice and tobacco as you move into the interior of, for example, North Carolina, South Carolina, or even beyond the fall line there in central Virginia. This is where those backcountry settlers, the Scots-Irish, and later the Germans, were settling in the decades after the 1720s. So again, that gives you an idea. And finally, you see a beaver pelt stretched out in some areas in the extreme sections of western North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, along areas of north of Philadelphia, and even areas continue to be important along the Hudson River Valley in New York and New England. So that gives you a little idea. That's why I like this map. It gives you some impression of what's being mostly grown, not really manufactured, in the American colonies. One of the things that was often not quite understood about the Navigation Acts were that the colonists didn't exactly like the regulations. They did smuggle, and they did try to bring in items that they weren't supposed to, and items that were supposed to be taxed, they didn't always pay the tax on them. But the English had set up a system by which they said, look, your raw materials that you grow in the American colonies, we're going to do our best to find a market for these things. Now, we can't always guarantee that the price of tobacco in 1760 is going to be great, or there's going to be a huge demand for things like barrel staves made in Connecticut or Massachusetts and able to be sent to places like the British West Indies or Jamaica or Barbados. But nevertheless, we will do our part as a parent country and make sure that we try to find markets for your goods. We'll take your items to France. Trade with the West Indies, the French West Indies, was on the rise in the 1720s and 30s. So West Indies or Caribbean planters were wanting to purchase American timber and food. Why? Well, they had to feed themselves somehow. We mentioned how on these sugar islands they were planting sugarcane all the way down to the water's edge, all the way down to the beach, if they could, completely changing the topography of these islands. So they needed to bring in firewood. They needed to bring in wood to make the barrel staves to store the molasses, which was then, as far as the French were concerned, the molasses was sent back from these islands in the Caribbean back to places like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. As long as grapes existed in the world, the French looked at molasses, which you turn into rum, and said, blech, we're not even interested. It's a byproduct of manufacturing sugar. We'll send it back to the American colonies. Now, the British, who were very much connected to the islands in the Caribbean as large planters, also had people that they could talk to in England. In fact, and they would have been lobbyists. Not the term that existed back then, but we would recognize them as lobbyists, people who go and speak on your behalf. And so lobbyists for the large sugar barons, or the very wealthy planters who had taken a large investment in slaves and human beings and in sugar mills, which is not an inexpensive crop to grow, well, they were lobbying members of parliament to say, hey, look, all of the New England colonists are purchasing French molasses. Why aren't they buying British molasses? And the answer simply was the French molasses was cheaper and it was of a better quality. And so they wanted to have this slowed down. The British sugar barons said, if we can actually get our so-called loyal colonists in areas of the American colonies to purchase British molasses, that would be great. So they got a tax put on foreign sugar. In 1733, Parliament passed the Molasses Act, a tax on foreign sugar. It wasn't paid. Colonists simply found a way to get around it. They would bribe customs agents. And what they would essentially do is say, look, we'll pay the bribe to the people who were inspecting the cargoes as they were coming into these seaboard cities. And we'll pay the bribe because the bribe is less than paying the tax. And the customs official will look the other way, and everyone is happy. The English knew it was happening. But again, under this policy we mentioned last time, salutary neglect, we're not going to enforce all of the laws. We're not going to use the British Navy to send over to American waters and make sure and shake down everybody to make sure that they are paying all these taxes. But I mentioned the Molasses Act because in about 30 years, the ways of the English colonists of smuggling, paying bribes, comes to a crashing halt. So again, this illustrates to us the way in which the Atlantic world, both sides of the Atlantic, whether it be in England or in the American colonies, were establishing closer ties during the decades of the 1700s. They were doing that in another manner as well, and that was in the form of governments that were emerging in the British American colonies. Let me make this a little larger, a bit easier for us to see. I want to briefly talk a little bit about that and point out and make a couple of observations that you may not be familiar with. First of all, as we know, each of the colonies have their own individual backstory. Georgia, as we're going to find out, very different than the story of Carolina. Massachusetts and Virginia, though they were formed by English men and women in the 1600s, they were formed by people with different goals, and clearly they were in different parts of the world, and so they developed differently. Nevertheless, these English colonies prided themselves on the fact that they governed themselves. Yes, they had to obey the laws of Parliament in the form of the Navigation Acts. They begrudgingly obeyed and followed the law. But there are three major types of American colonial governments, and it has a lot to do with the foundation story of each colony. Most of the American colonies were royal colonies, and by most I say 8 of the 13 colonies, where the king would appoint an official as the governor to represent the interest of the crown. Virginia was a royal colony, as was New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. So most of the colonies were royal colonies. A few of them actually were run by prominent families. In the case of Maryland, that would be the Calvert family, Lord Baltimore. That goes back to the 1630s and 40s, not long after Virginia was founded. In Pennsylvania and Delaware were essentially one colony until they were split. but the governor of Pennsylvania also ran the colony of Delaware. And that was, again, titled a proprietary colony, where essentially you had a family or a group of gentlemen. In the beginning, Carolina was a proprietary colony until the people who were there in the colony said, nah, we'd like to kind of run things on our own right here in Carolina. And we're kind of able to wiggle away the leadership from the Lords proprietors who were running Carolina. So that covers the second style of colony. The third would be charter colonies. Again, which a lot of people didn't take seriously because they had the crazy idea of electing their own governor. That would apply to Rhode Island and Connecticut. They were given charters, and in their charter, the people chose their governors. Usually, again, this is not a case of one size fits all. This is not a case of Parliament declaring, as of 1700, every colony will follow the same pattern of leadership. They didn't. Not at all. But beyond the governor, whether that governor be a member of a prominent family, elected by the people, and for the most part chosen by the king, a royal colony, there would be an upper house or a council that would be chosen by the crown or the governor of each colony, or sometimes the voters, and it was something of a modern equivalent to what we would now recognize maybe as the House of Lords, or the nobility, kind of seen as an upper chamber. Here it's explained another way, where you have the 8 royal colonies, several proprietary colonies, and the governor had most of the authority. So what you would have is some kind of colonial council in a legislature. A lot of the colonies had 2 houses, or bicameral was the term. There was an upper house that might have been chosen by the king or the proprietor. And then you had the colonial assembly, which was often the lower house. It was a representative government. And it was usually in the colonial assembly. Again, the council, kind of the upper chamber, they had close ties to the governor. They were kind of an advisory board, as this PowerPoint slide indicates. And they also would often act as a court in a judicial fashion for each of the different colonies. And this was a small number of people appointed by the governor, or sometimes chosen by the proprietor of the individual colony. In a couple of rare cases, they were actually chosen by the people or by the assembly. So at the top is the royal governor. And you can see in this slide, the governor represents the British crown. The governor represents, in the case of the Penn family, the interest of the Penn family. And that would apply from Pennsylvania and also to Delaware. Same with the Calvert descendants in Maryland. Now, every colony, for the most part, had some form of assembly, often called the lower house, that was chosen by the representative voters. In this case, you had to be a man, an adult, and own land. But this is where the laws were made. They had the authority to raise taxes and to institute revenue measures so that the colony could get its own money. They were voted into office by the landowners. Again, you had to own land to vote. If you didn't own, and most people in the American colonies, a much higher percentage than in England, own land. And so you have a lot more voting opportunities for folks in the American colonies. They voted for taxes. They didn't always like taxes. And when the governor wanted to say things like, well, we need some new roads built to the interior, and we would like to adjust the tax that is paid to the Anglican ministers in the colony of Virginia, for example. Sometimes the colonial assembly would balk or hesitate in approving these taxes because they represent the people. And the interest of the royal governor, in the case of Virginia, and the interest of the royal governor was the interest of the crown, didn't always go hand in hand with the colonial assembly. So the governor, who was able to tell the assembly, look, if you don't agree to what I'd like to be done for this particular session of the legislature, I can send you all home. To which the assembly would respond, well, we control your salary. And so there's a back and forth here. There are different interests working within each colony that you should be aware of. We call this time in the 1700s the rise of the assemblies. These assemblies began to assert more power against the governors. The interest of the crown, or the royal, or the family in charge of the colony, wasn't always the interest of the people. So, as I say there in the notes, you could withhold a salary of the governor, or a raise if the governor would like to make more money. He's out here in the middle of nowhere as far as he's concerned, and he would like to get a decent pay for his service to the crown. So that's why the assembly had the power to tax, or what we would call the power of the purse. And the English back in London kind of begrudgingly allowed this to happen. They weren't thrilled that the colonies were making these own decisions. They thought they could legislate within each of the colonies from London. Ooh, that ran into a rude awakening in the 1760s, as we're going to find out. So on the small scale, that's how the different colonies operate. Two other things you need to know about the colonial government system. The first is that no colonist sits in Parliament. Now, that takes a second to sink in, because you might ask the question, how are the interests of the American colonies? How are they represented in Parliament? Well, members of Parliament would say, I represent not only the people in England, but I also represent the people of the American colonies. And you might ask that member of Parliament, have you ever set foot in Maryland? And he would say, hell no, I don't want to go there. I might get scalped. So there's an image among the people in Parliament that, look, the colonies are kind of a developmental backwater, and I wouldn't go there if I could help myself. But they also maintain this kind of fiction. It's called virtual representation. I have that term there in the notes. That I may represent, I may live and live my whole life in England, but my votes are also taking into consideration the Americans in the colonies. That might surprise you to learn that fact. The other fact that you might be surprised to learn is that there is no central colonial legislature. In other words, you have 13 individual governments, and you might ask the question, is there a place where representative of the different colonies will go and sit in one town, in one place, in one building, and make decisions? And the answer is no. Each colony governs itself. They're jealous of each other. They refuse to help each other out. They squabble over things like where one colony ends and another begins. Western boundaries. Who's going to patrol the waters for pirates off the coast of North or South Carolina? Representations in the central part of the colonies. People who begin to settle in areas, we said the backcountry in North Carolina, they begin to make up a larger part of the population, except they only have one county representing all of western North Carolina, and they say, wait a minute, there's more of us living here. Shouldn't we have more counties, as many as there are in the east? And the folks who are in eastern North Carolina might say, no, that kind of waters down our influence in the colonial legislature. So no colonist sits in Parliament, and there is no central colonial legislature. The Congress of the Colonies, no. There's nothing like that until 1774, the first Continental Congress. They had tried, and we're going to discuss a couple of the attempts at having some kind of organization like that, but they utterly fail. So power in the 1700s is shared. Parliament set the trade rules. They kind of follow this idea of, look, we're not going to push the issue about smuggling until they actually start pushing the issue in the 1760s. But to finish this discussion on the colonial governments, there are a lot of gray areas that remain. The colonies tax themselves, but can Parliament tax the colonies from Parliament? Certainly they can raise revenue when it comes to things like taxing foreign molasses, but what about reaching into each colony and taxing there in that manner? Unsure. Gray areas, as I say here in the notes. Well, one of the last colonies that the English organized after 1700, and this completes the organization of 13 mainland colonies, is that of Georgia. Georgia is the last British colony organized along the Atlantic on the mainland. 126 years after the creation of Jamestown and Virginia. And it was started originally as kind of a defensive colony. And that will become more clear to you as we look at this slide. It makes sense, right? Here you have Spanish Florida. The Spanish had put themselves near what's now Jacksonville at their San Augustine fort ever since the end of the 1500s. The English now are increasingly confident at their ability to stretch their colonies further south. And so in 1733, they give permission to create a new colony there along the Savannah River. And the origin and the main purpose for the creation of Carolina is as a defensive colony. If the Spanish were to ever launch a military effort, either by land or by sea, into the valuable colony of Carolina, you can see how Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia are neighbors. If the Spanish were to ever do that, they would have to, at least if they went by land, have to go through Georgia. So Georgia could rally very quickly. It was kind of, we might, for lack of a better expression, call it a buffer colony, a military colony. And it was created by this gentleman. This man is James Oglethorpe, who operated in two worlds. Some have called him a philanthropic do-gooder, and I don't think that's entirely inaccurate. I think that Oglethorpe wanted to start a colony. He's a member of Parliament, number one. He's also a military officer. So he understands the value in, number one, creating this military colony to protect Carolina from an invasion of Spanish Florida. He also understands the situation in England. It had always been the goal of the creators of the colonies to make the colonies something of a safety valve for people that you want to get rid of in England. You know, like pesky Congregationalists, Puritans, like Quakers who didn't take oaths to the government, or the poor or those in debt. And that's where Georgia was founded as a haven for English debtors. That was the original goal when it was put together in the 1730s. It also was going to protect any thrust out of French Louisiana that would be directed at Carolina. Something that the Carolina settlers had done in the 1680s, I talked about this with the creation of South Carolina, is that they had gone through one of their early industries was an Indian slave trade. This caused a massive amount of disruption in Indian societies, so much so that when the French moved their settlements along the Gulf from Mobile and Biloxi, or really Ocean Springs in Mississippi, to the actual Mississippi River, they had to put down a civil war between Indians, and a lot of it had to do with the English Indian slave trade. So it made sense from two perspectives to have this creation of the colony of Georgia. So it was the first English mainland colony that would be supported by the English taxpayer. Parliament voted the funds by which Georgia would be created. And as I say there in the notes, it's these high-minded philanthropic ideas by Oglethorpe and others in Parliament. What they said was, first, we'll send people who are in debt, we'll send soldiers, and it will protect the colony. We also maybe will be able to manufacture in Georgia items that we buy from other parts of the world. Silkworms. We'll grow grapes in Georgia, and so we don't have to buy French or Spanish wine. It's also going to be a haven for the folks in England who are in debt. And a lot of people, if you're not very well connected, if you were in debt, you were thrown in jail. So again, the safety valve idea. Send these folks who would be very grateful to be out of jail and then participate in the founding of this colony. So early on in 1733, we have the creation of the colony of Georgia. Here is an artist's rendition of the first settlement along the Savannah River. You can see what they were trying to do here. This wasn't going to be a sprawling set of towns and farms like Virginia. they were going to create. There's the Savannah River at the bottom of the slide. And you could, of course, have this very well-ordered system of small farms. They put in place early on in the history of Georgia 3 bans. First, they banned lawyers. Why? Well, lawyers were going to sue on behalf of the colonists. Do not limit the amount of land that they had. One of the complaints about the early settlers in Georgia on this, again, Savannah town, which became the city of Savannah later on. And Georgia becomes one of the fastest growing colonies in all of the British Atlantic world. But there was a lot of dissatisfaction among those because they were limited in the amount of land that they could acquire. They were also very unhappy with Oglethorpe and Company, who had banned slaves and alcohol. Alcohol you banned because, well, you traded it with the Indians, and that could lead to conflict. It also created idleness among people who were supposed to, again, you can see from this slide, carve out a small town in the wilderness. The second ban was on slaves. Not because Oglethorpe and Company all of a sudden had a crisis of conscience and said, you know what, slavery's bad. Owning other people, maybe not a good idea. That wasn't the reason. The reason is because they wanted these early settlers in Georgia to do manual labor. And one of the early complaints among the early settlers, remember, these are folks, many of whom were poor, in debt. Some of them were soldiers, Highlanders, sent from Scotland to be used as shock troops. They were French Huguenots who were religious dissenters. These are French Protestants. They were making their way to colonial Savannah, later to colonial Georgia. And their complaints were twofold. First, Oglethorpe and Company are not letting us realize our full economic potential by getting more land, acquiring more land. But you can see the purpose of limiting the amount of land that people would have. If you have this sprawling colony like Virginia, it completely defeats the purpose of creating Georgia, right? You need a colony that you can fire a gun or a cannon and very quickly organize a defense by which the Spanish would have to make their way through Savannah in order to jeopardize or threaten Carolina's existence. The ban on slaves was because Oglethorpe said, look, there's a now accepted idea among the English people, and especially in the colonies, that slaves and slaves only would do manual labor, and we don't want that to be the case. It's one of their, I think, philanthropic and at the end probably very unrealistic goals. As a military colony, however, Georgia thrives. In 1739, war along the border between the Spanish in Florida and the English colonists actually were able to defend the Georgian Carolina colonists and attack from Spain. Savannah became, as I mentioned with who was settling the area, something of a melting pot. They promised those settlers religious toleration. Now, the official church of the colony of Georgia would be the Anglican Church, but those who were not Anglicans were permitted to settle there. The settlers, however, would go back, or they would try to complain as often as they could about the restrictions that were put upon them. No alcohol. You couldn't trade alcohol with the Indians or anyone else. No slaves. Well, they start making arguments like, it's our natural born right as Englishmen to own other people. I guess they were completely clueless about the natural born rights of those who were going to be enslaved. So all of these limits that were put on the colony to ensure the survival of the colony and to make sure the mission of the colony were a success were broken down one by one. The last one to hold out was the ban on slaves, which actually remained in place for nearly 2 decades until it was lifted by the English government. The reason that it was lifted, the reason that the other bans eventually went away, especially the one on alcohol, is that settlers from South Carolina began to drift across the river, the border between South Carolina and Georgia, and they brought alcohol into the colony. They brought slaves in as well, and the new settlers around Savannah said, why can't we have these things as well? And so in short order, after 1752, the colony became a lot like, developed, for better or worse, much like South Carolina. Large rice and indigo farms and plantations worked by slaves, again, one of the fastest growing British colonies in the Atlantic world. But it also became a hotbed for, and this is the connection between the revivals of religion that happened in the 1730s and 40s and the promise that Georgia had of religious toleration. Again, toleration doesn't mean necessarily acceptance or widespread celebration of people who are not Anglicans, but they didn't exactly chase anybody out who wasn't of the official faith of the colony. And that included John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, or the Methodist Church, not only in the American colonies, but also in England. This is a way we can connect to the discussions that we're going to have in the future on the Great Awakening. Wesley, in the late 1730s, began to do missionary work in places such as in England, and then came to the American colonies like other traveling ministers. He also preached to poor whites, to slaves and Indians. And this connection between Georgia, the New World, and England, the Old, is particularly important. So it finishes the story of the development of the 13 colonies, each of which have their own unique backstory, each of which makes them rather unique. But you see in the case of Georgia, by virtue of it being further south, that its original development was to be, of course, a defensive colony, one to protect by more and more, which was clear to the English. Their most valuable mainland colony, with the investment of rice and land and slaves, was South Carolina. And in many cases, it actually fulfilled that goal.